Welcome back, Spooklings, to your second volume of the Cursed Collection. I am Spooker, your ghostly guide here to help you get to sleep. Have you had any ghost experiences? I'd love to hear your own terrifying tales in the comment section. The day Lucy finally bought her house felt like a page torn straight out of a fairy tale. Willow Grove, as the house was called, had everything she'd ever wanted: a sprawling garden blooming with wildflowers, grand archways, enormous rooms with intricate woodwork, and a rich history that gave it plenty of character. It sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, flanked by old, twisting willow trees, giving it the perfect balance of charm and mystery. As she moved in, she noticed the neighbors standing at a distance. They watched her with furrowed brows and hesitant waves. At first, she thought it was curiosity, but their wariness became clear when Mrs. Harlow from next door approached her on the second day. "You seem like a nice young woman," Mrs. Harlow said, her eyes darting nervously toward the house. "But Willow Grove isn't like other homes. You need to be careful." Lucy chuckled lightly. "Careful of what? The plumbing?" Mrs. Harlow's expression darkened. "Just pay attention to the mirrors. And if you hear whispers, for heaven's sake, leave." Lucy thought it was just a strange warning from an eccentric neighbor. She waved it off as superstition. But that night, as she unpacked in her grand bedroom, something about the gilded mirror above the fireplace gave her pause. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, almost as if something beneath it pulsed faintly. She shook off the uneasy feeling and went to bed. Over the next few weeks, Lucy began noticing peculiarities in the house. It wasn't the creaking floors or the occasional cold drafts that unsettled her. She had expected those in an older home. It was the mirrors. In the mornings, she would catch glimpses of movements in the mirrors that didn't match her own. When she stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her hair, her reflection would seem to linger for just a fraction too long when she moved. And late one night, as she passed the hallway mirror on her way to bed, she saw something horrifying. Her reflection smiled at her, though she hadn't moved a muscle. Panic set in. Lucy tried to reason with herself, attributing it to her exhaustion or overactive imagination. But the house felt different now. The rich character that had drawn her to it began to feel like something more sinister, as though unseen eyes watched her every move. When she confided in Mrs. Harlow about what she saw, the older woman paled. "You didn't open the basement door, did you?" she asked. Lucy hesitated. She hadn't, but she had noticed it a heavy oak door at the far end of the house, leading to a basement she assumed was filled with old junk. Mrs. Harlow grabbed her hand, her voice trembling. "If you value your life, don't go down there." But Lucy wasn't easily frightened. Despite the unease creeping into her life, she resolved to face whatever secrets Willow Grove held. Her determination would soon lead her to the very heart of its darkness. The night Lucy first heard the whispers, she was standing in the kitchen washing dishes. It started as a soft murmur, so faint she thought it might be the wind. But when the sound grew louder, she froze. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the basement door. Against her better judgment, Lucy approached the door. Her pulse quickened as her hand rested on the cool brass doorknob. The whispers stopped abruptly, as though whatever was behind the door knew she was there. A part of her screamed to turn around and leave, but curiosity pulled her forward. She opened the door and flicked on the light, revealing narrow wooden steps descending into darkness. Dust swirled in the air, and the faint scent of damp earth reached her nose, as she descended. The light bulb overhead flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and crates, but at the far end something caught her ajar door. Unlike the rest of the basement, this door was pristine, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe when she looked too closely. Lucy approached cautiously. When she placed her hand on the door, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They weren't in English, but their urgency and malice were unmistakable. Beyond the door was a hidden room, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with odd artifacts, candles melted to their stubs, animal bones arranged in strange patterns, and books bound in cracked leather. At the center of the room was an altar, its surface stained with dark, dried streaks. Lucy's stomach turned. This wasn't just an old storage room, it was a place where something terrible had happened. She noticed an open book on the altar, its pages filled with illegible writing and crude drawings of grotesque figures. One, put up them, depicted a woman standing in front of a mirror, her reflection no longer her own. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. Willow Grove wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Whatever rituals had been performed here had bound something malevolent to the house, something that lived in the mirrors and fed on the fear of those who entered. As Lucy stepped back from the altar, she heard a low growl. The shadows in the room deepened, and a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was Herb, not her. The thing's eyes glowed red, and its twisted smile made her blood run cold. The entity lunged at Lucy, its movements unnaturally quick. She bolted up the stairs, the whispers following her as if they were alive. When she reached the kitchen, the lights flickered violently, and every mirror in the house cracked simultaneously. She grabbed her phone and called Mrs. Harlow, her voice frantic. "It's real. The mirrors, the basement. What do I do?" Mrs. Harlow's voice was steady but urgent. "The ritual must be undone. Destroy the altar and burn the book. But be warned, won't let you go so easily." Armed with a hammer and matches, Lucy returned to the basement. The air was thick with malice, and the growling whispers grew louder with every step. As she reached the altar, the entity materialized again, blocking her path. Its voice echoed in her mind, a cacophony of rage and despair. "You can't destroy me. I am this house." Summoning every ounce of courage, Lucy swung the hammer, shattering the altar. The entity screamed, its form flickering like static. She grabbed the book and set it ablaze, the flames consuming it in an unnatural blue light. The room quaked, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar before fading into silence. As the fire died down, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The air felt lighter, and the house seemed to exhale, as though relieved of its dark burden. Lucy emerged from the basement, her body trembling but alive. The mirrors, once cracked, were now gone entirely, their frames empty. The neighbors watched from afar as Lucy stepped onto the porch, a look of quiet resolve on her face. She sold Willow Grove the following week, leaving the house and its dark past behind. Though she would never forget the terror she endured, she found solace in knowing she had broken the curse. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would see faint reflections in the windows and wonder if the house's darkness had truly been vanquished, merely biding its time. It was meant to be the perfect getaway. 5 friends, Mia, Jake, Sophie, Liam, and Emerset, out for Sandy Island, a secluded retreat nestled in the heart of a vast lake, accessible only by a creaking old ferry. The island had gained a reputation among locals as untouched wilderness. To the group, it sounded like an adventure. To the villagers, it was a place best left undisturbed. As the ferry groaned and docked on the overgrown shore, the friends marveled at the eerie beauty of the Bylum. Towering pines lined the shore, swaying gently as if they were alive. The wind carried a faint whistle, almost melodic. Sophie teased, "Bet it's haunted," and they all laughed, dismissing her jest. They chose a clearing near the lake to pitch their tents. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jake glanced at the water. Is it just me, or does the lake look off? The surface rippled unnaturally, as if touched by unseen hands. They ignored it, thinking it was the current, but something unseen stirred beneath. The first night began innocently enough, a roaring fire, laughter echoing into the woods, ghost stories that made Emma roll her eyes. It's just an island. Nothing's gonna happen, you guys, she scoffed. But when Sophie reached for her phone to capture the moonlit view, it was gone. I swear I left it right here, she muttered, patting her jacket pocket frantically. You probably dropped it somewhere, Liam offered, shining a flashlight around. No, it was just Sophie stopped mid-sentence as a low, bone-chilling rustle broke through the silent woods. Everyone froze, exchanging nervous glances. Wind, Jake muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. The group dispersed to look for the missing phone, their flashlight beams cutting through the thick darkness. Moments later, Mia screamed. They ran to find her staring at something, a large, jagged claw mark gouged into a tree, glistening as if freshly carved. None of them had seen an animal large enough to leave such marks. This isn't normal, Sophie whispered. Unease settled in as the shadows grew deeper. When they returned to the campfire, they realized Liam was missing. Liam called, panic creeping into her voice. No answer. They grabbed their flashlights and retraced their steps. He probably wandered off to scare us, Mia said, trying to reassure herself. But her voice trembled, and the woods offered no comfort. The air felt heavier the deeper they went, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Jake suddenly tripped over something. When he swung his flashlight down, it revealed one of Liam's shoes. Nothing else. Just one lone shoe, mud clinging to its edges, the laces cleanly severed. "What the hell?" Jake whispered. Sophie shivered, clutching her jacket tightly as if to shield herself. Someone was watching them. They could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The next day, the ferry was supposed to return, but the lake was unnervingly still, its surface like glass. There was no boat in sight. Trapped for another night, the group's nerves frayed. Mia woke from a nap, her breathing ragged. "I saw something," she whispered. "In my dream, there was a figure in the water, waiting." "Stop," Jake snapped, his temper fraying. "You're scaring everyone." But strange occurrences mounted. Emma found muddy footprints circling the tents, though they were bare and too large to be human. Sophie reported hearing whispering at the edge of the woods, though no one was there. The island wasn't just haunted, it was, and it didn't want them there. That night it was Jake's turn to disappear. He had offered to gather firewood, his flashlight bobbing as he ventured into the trees. When he didn't return after an hour, Sophie's voice cracked. "We can't keep splitting up." They searched by moonlight, calling Jake's name until their voices grew hoarse. Near the lake's edge, they found his flashlight lying in the mud, still on. Its beams stretched eerily over the water's surface, illuminating bubbles rising then popping on the surface. A low, guttural sound rose from the water. "Run!" Mia screamed, her instincts overriding reason. They bolted back to the campsite, but Emma lagged behind. Sophie turned just in time to see Emma's feet vanish, as if yanked into the earth. Her muffled scream was the last thing they heard. Now there were three. By dawn, Sophie's sanity unraveled. She muttered nonsensical things about voices in the lake and shadows under the trees. Mia tried to keep her calm, but when Sophie walked toward the lake with glassy eyes, Mia lunged for her. "Get away from it," Mia yelled, grabbing Sophie's arm. But Sophie yanked free and stepped into the water. The moment she touched it, her body stiffened. "They're calling for me," Sophie murmured with an eerie calm. And then the water surged upward, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her under. In seconds, the lake was still again. Now there was one, alone, shaking and clutching. Her knife, Mia ventured toward the forest's center. She couldn't wait any longer for rescue. The island had claimed her friends one by one, and she had to understand why. Following faint symbols carved into the trees, she stumbled upon a clearing with a stone altar, moss-covered and cracked with age. Around it were skeletal remains, some human, some animal. A faded journal lay among the bones. With trembling hands, Mia opened it. The journal belonged to a settler who had lived on the island centuries ago. It detailed a dark secret. the settlers, had angered a primordial spirit that dwelled in the lake. To appease it, they performed sacrificial rituals, suffering their own people to the water. But when the settlers abandoned the island, the spirit turned vengeful, binding its curse to the land. The last entry read, "The lake whispers, it hungers." As Mia absorbed the grim revelations, the trees behind her began to groan. Twisting shadows stretched from the forest, slithering toward her. The spirit wasn't confined to the water, it was the island itself. Desperate, Mia remembered the knife in her hand. She made a choice. She would destroy the journal and altar in one final act of defiance. If the curse stemmed from this, perhaps she could break it. She lit a fire, feeding the pages of the journal to the flames. The air screamed around her as the island writhed in fury. Shadows clawed at her, their ghostly voices begging, pleading, cursing. When the last page burned, Mia smashed the altar with the knife, shattering the stone into jagged shards. The earth beneath her heaved, and the lake erupted in a violent spray of water. For a moment, it seemed the island might devour her as well. But then, silence. The shadows receded, and the trees stood still. The oppressive weight lifted. Mia staggered to the shoreline just as the ferry arrived, its captain looking confused. She climbed aboard without a word, the horrors of Sandy Island forever etched into her memory. Mia never spoke of what had happened. The villagers refused to believe her when she returned, and the island was deemed off-limits though. The ferry captain claimed he'd seen something dark in the water the day he returned. But Mia knew the truth. Sandy Island's curse might have been quieted, but some things never truly die. At night, in her dreams, she still heard whispers, whispers from the lake calling her back. Sunday dawned quietly in the Joneses' neighborhood until Mrs. Jones spotted Etherbox. It sat beneath the old oak in their backyard like it had grown out of the earth itself. The small wooden box was wrapped tightly in frayed rope, sealed with hardened, uneven drips of red candle wax, and studded with black feathers that quivered unnaturally in the breeze. "Tom, did you see this?" she called, her voice tinged with unease. Mr. Jones joined her at the window, brow furrowing. "What the hell is that? Another one of those kids' pranks." He tried to sound dismissive, but there was something about the way the box sat so perfectly at the tree's roots that made the hairs on his neck stand up. Neither dared to touch it directly. Armed with a garden rake, Mr. Jones carefully lifted the box and dropped it into a garbage bag, tying it tightly. Together they hauled it to the trash bin at the end of the drive. Mrs. Jones exhaled as the lid slammed shut. "That's done," she said, though a cold knot of dread settled in her stomach. The next morning, Mrs. Jones froze in the living room doorway. The air was stagnant, tinged with the faint scent of burnt wood. There, sitting dead center on the coffee table, was the box. Its details were identical: the frayed rope, the wax, the unnerving feathers. Yet now the wax seemed fresher, glistening as though it had been dripped just moments before. She screamed for Tom, who rushed in, stopping dead at the sight. But, I threw it away, he stammered. How did it get here? Desperation drove them to greater lengths. That evening they carried the box to the edge of the woods behind their property. Mr. Jones heaved it over the fence, deep into the thicket. They heard it crash among branches and fall silent. Yet, just as they turned to leave, Mrs. Jones thought she heard a faint sound, a low hum, like someone exhaling slowly. Mrs. Jones awoke in the dead of night to an empty bed. At first, she thought Tom had gone to get water, but when she heard the back door creak open, she sprang out of bed. Peering through the window, she saw him, barefoot and sleepwalking, his silhouette disappearing into the woods. She raced after him, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Branches snapped underfoot, and her breath came in short gasps. "Tom, Tom, stop," she called, but he didn't respond. When she finally caught up, she found him standing in the clearing where they'd tossed the box. He cradled it in his hands, staring at it with a glassy, lifeless expression. The box seemed to thrum faintly, almost like it was breathing. "Tom," she shouted, shaking him. He blinked rapidly, as though waking from a dream, before staring down at the box in horror. I don't know why I'm here," he mumbled, dropping it. "Let's go," she urged, dragging him back home. But the box wasn't done with them yet. The following morning, Mrs. Jones found it waiting for them, again this time in the middle of the lounge. The ropes had been undone, and the wax seals lay melted into puddles on the floor. The lid was by jar, its interior a gaping black void that seemed to pull at the edges of her vision. The air around the box was suffocating, charged with an unseen energy. The mirrors on the walls began to fog up one by one, until words formed on their surfaces. "Let me out," Mrs. Jones stumbled back, clutching her chest. "Tom, what have we done?" Whatever was inside the box was no longer contained. That night Tom's demeanor changed. He sat at the kitchen table, staring into space, as if listening to something no one else could hear. When Mrs. Jones touched his shoulder, he snapped his head toward her, his eyes dark and wild. "It speaks to me," he whispered. When she awoke hours later, Tom was gone. Panicking, she searched the house and yard, but he was nowhere to be found. Then the sirens came red and blue lights flashing through her window. The police arrived at dawn with grim news. A neighbor had been brutally murdered in the street, the body mutilated beyond recognition. Mrs. Jones froze. Her husband returned. Minutes later, disheveled and covered in dirt, claiming he had no memory of where he'd been, but she saw the truth in his eyes. Desperate for answers, Mrs. Jones returned to the box. Hidden within its lining, she found scraps of parchment covered it pit in faded symbols. Among them was a name, Melrick Jones. She froze. This was her husband's great-grandfather, a man who, according to family lore, had vanished decades ago after dabbling in the occult. A frantic search led her to an old diary kept by one of Melric's contemporaries. It spoke of forbidden rituals and deals struck with dark forces. The box, it seemed, was no ordinary object, but a vessel for an ancient demoner, demon-bound to the bloodline of the man who had summoned it. And now it wanted Tom, night after night. Mr. Jones vanished, and bodies began to pile up in the village. Each time he returned home covered in blood, with no recollection of his deeds. The box sat in the living room, humming softly, its influence growing stronger. The mirrors in the house no longer reflected reality. Mrs. Jones caught glimpses of twisted, horrifying versions of herself, grinning back at her with malice. The final straw came when she found him sharpening a knife at the kitchen table, his face utterly devoid of emotion. "It wants you," he said flatly, "to complete the ritual." Mrs. Jones knew she had to act quickly. With trembling hands, she gathered candles, chalk, and every ounce of courage she could muster. The diary had described a way to seal the demon once more, but it required a sacrifice, as her husband prowled the house. Muttering unintelligible words, she set up the ritual circle in the basement. When he finally entered, the box cradled in his hands, she began to chant the incantation. The room erupted in chaos. Shadows spilled out of the box like living ink, slithering up the walls and wrapping around her husband. He screamed, his voice mingling with the guttural roars of the demon. "Tom," she cried, tears streaming down her face, but he was gone. The shadows collapsed inward, pulling the boxand him into the void. And then silence. Willow Grove stands empty now, its windows boarded up and its gardens overgrown. Mrs. Jones left that night, the weight of her loss unbearable. But deep in the woods, if you listen closely, you can still hear whispers and insidious calling for someone new to find the box, because it always comes back. In the small, odd town of Whimsy Hollow, perched on the edge of a foggy forest, there stood a crooked old house known as the Crockery. It wasn't haunted in the traditional sense, no wailing ghosts or cursed relics, but it had a reputation, put the fore being a little off. People in town said the Crockery was home to secrets, and yet nobody could pinpoint just what that meant. Marigold Plimblethorpe, a young woman with a fondness for tea parties by herself and collecting absurdly small hats for no reason in particular, inherited the Crockery from her great-uncle Percival. Percival had been a bit of an odd duck, rumoured to spend his evenings knitting sweaters for spiders and whistling tunes he swore the wind taught him. Marigold moved in, and was enchanted by the house's quirksits, staircases that sometimes led nowhere, its cabinet that only opened on Thursdays, and a doorknob that hummed Bohemian Rhapsody when touched. What she didn't anticipate, however, was the owl. Not just any owl. This was Clarence. Clarence wasn't exactly corporeal. He perched on the rafters, semi-transparent, with bright yellow eyes that glowed faintly like an old, misplaced flashlight. The first time Marigold saw him, he was reading an upside-down dictionary, muttering nonsensical definitions to himself. Ah, the heir to the crokery has arrived. Clarence hooted in a voice with far too many vowels for comfort. You ... talk? Marigold asked, clutching her kettle as if it were the last bastion of sanity. Of course I talk, dear girl, Clarence replied, his wings flaring dramatically like a ghostly Shakespearean actor. And you ought to listen, for this house has, how shall I put, eater flair for peculiarities. Things may wander when you're not looking. Wander, she repeated, unsure if she had just heard the spookiest statement of all time, or the world's weirdest real estate disclosure. But Clarence wasn't kidding. Strange. Happenings begin thought very night, as Marigold slept soundly beneath a pile of mismatched quilts. She awoke to a noise like bubble wrap being stomped on by an overly enthusiastic clog dancer. She flicked on her bedside lamp and discovered that her collection of miniature hats had assembled themselves into a jaunty parade. Marigold, who prided herself on being unflappable and perhaps a bit too curious, followed the procession as it shuffled down the hallway and into the attic. There, the hats paused in a circle around an ancient, dust-coated painting of her gretuncle Percival. In the painting, Percival looked different. His face had shifted, his eyes were wider, too bright, and his painted hands now held what appeared to be a steaming pot of tea. Oh, don't mind him, Clarence said, materializing out of thin air to perch atop an armoire. Percival always had a thing for dramatics. He liked to leave souvenirs for the next occupant. His luminous eyes glinted mischievously. But he didn't tell you about the ruckus, did he? The ruckus? Marigold asked, the weight of dread settling in her chest. Oh, it's harmless, mostly harmless. But some nights the house likes to stir things up. A little game, if you will. Items move, shadows grow teeth, chairs whisper limericks, and something not saying what likes to knock 3 times on your ceiling just to keep you alert. That sounds far from harmless. Clarence, you'll manage, or you won't, he replied casually, and then vanished into the painting, leaving Marigold surrounded by a parade of animate hats. The ruckus in full swing. The second night, Marigold was beginning to realize that sleep would soon become a distant memory. The house came alive in ways she couldn't have imagined. Her teacups rearranged themselves into pyramids. The grandfather clock in the hallway insisted on chiming Happy New Year every 12 minutes, and her shadow began politely, asking if it could borrow some sugar dot still. Things escalated further on the 3rd night, when Marigold noticed something newer mirror in the dining room, cracked but oddly clean, reflecting not herself, but an empty, misty forest. She approached it slowly, and the glass rippled like water before she could retreat. Clarence popped up again, his semi-transparent feathers fluffed in amusement. Ah, the mirror of Etheres. I was wondering when you'd find that It's not a mirror, technically speaking. What is it, then? Marigold demanded. Oh, just a tiny portal. Small thing. The occasional fox wanders through, but I wouldn't touch it unless you're fond of banishing interdimensional beings who smell like burnt toast. As if on cue, a faint guttural noise rumbled from the mirror. Something shifted on the other side, just out of focus-a shape too elongated to be human, its spindly hands scratching at the glass. Clarence, this is not cozy bedtime nonsense anymore, Marigold shouted, unveiling the truth desperate for answers. Marigold rummaged through her great-uncle's belongings. She found a battered journal hidden in the depths of the library. Inside were entries describing the Croakery's inhabitants. One page read: if you hear the knock on the ceiling, don't answer it. If the chairs compose limericks, laugh politely but show no fear. If the mirror of Aetherius ripples, for the love of all things tear-related, lock the doors. As she read, the knock came. 3 deliberate, booming knocks from the ceiling above. Her chest tightened, but she didn't look up. She grabbed a candlestick and bolted for the front door, only to find Clarence blocking her path. You can't leave, the owl said, his yellow eyes gleaming. Not yet. Why not? Because you haven't won, Marigold. The house wants a victor. It's a game, remember. What happens if I lose? Clarence hesitated. The house keeps you. The final night determined to end the madness. Marigold stormed into the attic, where the painting of her great uncle now stared at her smugly. Tell me how to stop this, she shouted. The air around her grew heavy, and from the painting a muffled voice whispered, "Tea." "What?" she gasped. "Tea," Clarence repeated, suddenly perched on her shoulder. "You heard the man. He was obsessed with tea. Have you considered offering the house a proper cuppa, perhaps an oolong?" Nobody argues with oolong. Though it sounded utterly absurd, Marigold had no better plan. She brewed the finest pot of tea she could muster, placed it on the attic floor, and said, "All right, Croakery, have a brew. Let's call a truce." The house groaned. The walls shuddered. For a moment she thought she might be swallowed whole. But then the noises stopped. The mirror stilled, her teacups settled, and Clarence gave a satisfied hoot. "Well, I'll be. Looks like you've won." A round of applause for the underdog. He crowed. The morning after one, Marigold awoke the next day. The house was eerily still, almost as if the events of the past nights had been a fever dream. Clarence was gone. The mirror reflected only her own exhausted face. Though life returned to normal as the Croakery could offer Marigold, couldn't quite shake the feeling that the house had merely gone dormant. But for now it seemed content. She kept a pot of tea on the stove at all times, just in case, and sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear Clarence muttering definitions of words that didn't exist, somewhere beyond the veil. Now, spooky pookies, I do not think you are ready for this next one. Sit tight and listen closely if you dare. In the windswept, forsaken town of Crowsand, legends didn't fade, they festered. At the heart of the town's most whispered tale was Grinny, a clown doll with a painted grin so wide it seemed to split its porcelain face in two. They said Grinny wasn't just a doll. Every 100 years its painted smile would crack, its hollow body would shift, and it would awaken not as a toy, but as something far more sinister. The tale was forgotten by most, buried under decades of fear and denial, until the year Greeny's curse returned. The Everetts had no idea what they were walking into when they purchased the rundown Victorian house on Black Hollow Road. It was affordable, with plenty of room for their 9-year-old daughter, Lily, to play. While cleaning the attic one crisp October morning, Lily stumbled across an old, dusty trunk tucked behind rotting boxes. Inside, nestled in moth-eaten fabric, was Grinny. The doll's face was unnerving, its smile unnaturally wide. The colors of its makeup faded to a disturbing pallor. Its eyes, lifeless and glassy, seemed to glint in the attic's dim light. "Mom, look what I found," Lily yelled, rushing down the creaking stairs with the doll clutched to her chest. Her mother, Claire, recoiled. "That thing looks creepy, sweetie. Maybe we should leave it up there." But Lily begged to keep it. She named it Grinny, after the peculiar grin that seemed to follow her wherever she turned. Claire relented. But the moment she saw Grinny perched on Lily's dresser that night, she felt something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The doll that moveth. First few nights were quiet enough, but that didn't last. Grinny, it seemed, had a habit of moving. Lily would leave it seated on her dresser, only to find it in a different position by morning. It stood by her bed once, its fixed glass eyes staring down at her. Claire and her husband, Sam, assumed Lily was moving the doll in her sleep. They didn't know what else to believe. "I didn't touch it," Lily insisted one morning. "Grinny moves on his own." "You probably just forgot you moved him," Sam replied, though his tone lacked conviction. The uneasy air around the house thickened when Claire began hearing faint sounds, at night's soft taps, like footsteps. It started in Lily's room, then moved into the hallway. She would check every creak and shadow, but nothing was ever there. At least, nothing she could see. Then there was the laughter, soft, stuttering giggles in the dead of night, too quiet to be Lily's, and too close for comfort. The awakening art was the night before Halloween, when Grinny took its first real step. Claire was up late, folding laundry in the living room, when she heard a faint scrape like porcelain dragging across the hardwood floor. "Sam," she called out. No answer then. From the corner of her eye, she saw a movement, just the faintest twitch of shadow near the staircase. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. Grinny was sitting on the bottom step, staring directly at her. Her heart raced. "Lily," she whispered, inching closer. "Did you put Grinny here?" As she reached for the door, the lights flickered, and an icy chill swept through the room. Grinny's painted smile seemed wider, impossibly so. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were watching. When the lights stabilized, Grinny was gone. The night of the Kershalowen arrived with a heavy fog that settled over Krause, and like a suffocating blanket, the evening Lily ran downstairs screaming, "Mum, Grinny's gone. He's not in my room." Claire felt a chill creep down her spine as she glanced at Sam. They searched the house, but Grinny was nowhere to be found. At midnight, the power cut out. Claire fumbled for a flashlight, the beam casting shifting shadows across the walls. A faint sound echoed through the house-heavy footsteps, much too heavy to be Lily's. They seemed to come from the attic. "Stay here with Lily," Sam said, grabbing a kitchen knife. He climbed the attic stairs, but moments later, Claire heard him scream. She raced up after him, the flashlight trembling in her hand. What she found made her blood run cold. The trunk where Grinny had been stored was open, its contents scattered. Sam stood frozen, staring at the wall, where someone or something had written in jagged red letters, "It's time." Behind him, Grinny was no longer a doll. Its porcelain body had cracked and fallen away, revealing a towering figure, grotesque and twisted. Its clown makeup was smeared across its leathery skin, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. Its eyes burned with an unholy light. "Where's Lily?" Grinny growled, its voice a deep, guttural rasp. Grinny vanished into the night, leaving the Everetts in shattered silence. They found Lily's room empty, her bed untouched. Desperate, Claire and Sam searched the house and yard, but there was no trace of her. Only a single red balloon drifted on the porch, its string swaying in the breeze. They called the police, but even as officers combed the woods and nearby streets, Claire knew they wouldn't find her daughter. Not unless they faced Grin Nye. As the hours passed, Grinny left his mark across Krausnand. The sound of cruel laughter echoed through the fog-shrouded streets. Doors slammed open and shut on their own. People reported fleeting glimpses of a tall, monstrous figure standing under flickering streetlights, its impossibly wide grin gleaming in the dark. Then the bodies began appearing. The trail led Claire and Sam to an abandoned amusement park on the edge of town, long forgotten and overrun with vines. The gates swung open as they approached, revealing a flickering carousel that groaned with each turn. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint sound of calliope music played, warbling and out of tune. Dot in the center of the carousel sat Grinny, his long, spindly arms cradling Lily. She was unconscious, her head resting against his grotesque chest. "You can't stop this," Grinny growled, his voice a cacophony of whispers layered with screams. "She belongs to me now." Sam to lunge, but Grinny swatted him aside with inhuman strength. Claire screamed, begging for her daughter back, but the clown only laughed, the sound echoing like a thunderstorm. Claire's desperation turned to fury. She remembered the trunk in the attic and the scraps of paper it had contained. Among them had been a single word etched in shaky handwriting: "Fire, Sam, the lighter." She yelled. Sam bloodied and dazed, fumbled in his pocket and tossed her a lighter. Claire grabbed an old lantern from the carousel's edge, smashing it and spilling kerosene across the floor. Grinny roared as the flames ignited his laughter, turning to a deafening screech. The fire consumed the carousel, and as the flames licked higher, Grinny's body began to crack and crumble. His grin warped, his burning eyes narrowing in rage. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice fading as his form dissolved into ash. Claire rushed forward, pulling Lily from the inferno. Just as the flames consumed the carousel, they collapsed outside the park, clutching each other as the fire lit up the night. The Everetts left Crow's End, but they knew the curse wasn't truly gone. Somewhere buried beneath ash and rubble, Grinny's essence lingered, waiting for the next century to awaken. And every so often, when the night was quiet and the wind just right, Claire could swear she heard faint, mocking laughter carried on the breeze. The town of Ashmore sat in the middle of nowhere, its crumbling buildings and empty streets giving off an eerie charm. A perfect setting for an escape room. 6 friends, Rachel, Marcus, Jen, Louise, Tara, and Adam, had driven out of the city for a weekend adventure, eager to try something unique and thrilling. Rumors about the Red Moon escape had intrigued them, its website promising an experience like no other, complete with 4 uniquely terrifying rooms. When they pulled up to the decrepit building where the escape rooms were housed, its towering structure loomed against a blood-red sky. Marcus joked nervously, "Looks like it's straight out of a horror movie. We're so doomed." Waiting outside was another group of escape room enthusiasts, for people in their mid-20s, loud and confident. Their leader, Jason, flashed a grin at Rachel. "Guess we'll see which group has the brains to win." The front door creaked open, and a man stepped out. His presence was unnerving. He was tall and rail-thin, with hollow cheekbones and eyes, like bottomless pits. He wore a tailored suit that looked slightly outdated, and introduced himself as Malphas, the game master. "Welcome," he said, his voice as smooth as silk, yet carrying an edge that made the air feel colder. "Tonight, under the red moon, you will enter our escape rooms. Choose your themes wisely, for these games demand wit, bravery, and sacrifice. Only the strong will leave victorious." Rachel nudged Louise. "This guy is too into his role," she whispered, though the goosebumps on her arms told a different story. Inside the building, 4 doors lined a long corridor. Each door was marked with a sign. Room 1, the haunted asylum room. 2, the cursed cabin room. 3, the carnival of the damned room. 4, the depths. Below, 2 groups eyed each other before Malphas interrupted. Only 2 rooms may be occupied at once. Choose wisely, and may the odds favor your survival. Jason's group picked the Carnival of the Damned immediately. Clowns, freak shows, bring it on, Jason laughed. Rachel and her friends exchanged uneasy glances before opting for Haunted Asylum. The Haunted Asylum was the stuff of nightmares, peeling wallpaper, flickering fluorescent lights, and the faint sound of whispers. As soon as the group stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, sealing with an audible click. A disembodied voice echoed through the room. It was Malthus, but now his tone dripped with malice. Welcome, players. You have 1 hour to escape. Solve the puzzles, or forfeit your souls. Rachel turned to Adam, her voice trembling. This is just part of the game, right? Just immersive effects. But as the clock on the wall began to tick loudly, the room seemed to shift. Furniture moved of its own accord. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the whispers grew louder. Meanwhile, Jason's group entered the Carnival of the Damned brightly. Colored lights blinked above their heads, and the smell of popcorn wafted through the air. The atmosphere was unnervingly cheerful, till the clown mannequins lining the walls began to move. One by one, their heads turned toward the group there, painted faces cracking to reveal rotting teeth. "We've got this, no problem," Jason said, though his bravado wavered. A riddle appeared on a glowing sign. "Find the key before the ringmaster finds you." Chapter 3. The games begin in the asylum. Rachel's group worked frantically. Clues were scattered across the walls. Cryptic phrases like, "The patient knows the way," and "Beware the doctor's cure." Terror opened a drawer and screamed as a skeletal hand fell out. "This feels too real," she whispered, backing away. The whispers grew louder until the group realized they weren't alone. A shadowy figure in a tattered hospital gown shuffled into the room, its movements slow and jerky. Its face was obscured, but it emitted a guttural sound that made their blood run cold. "Move," Marcus yelled, pulling the group into the next room, where a riddle awaited them. Cure the patient to advance, but not all cures bring healing. Meanwhile, in the carnival, Jason's group faced horrors of their own. The key they needed was hidden within a maze of mirrors, but the reflections weren't theirs. Instead, distorted versions of themselves stared back, sneering and mocking their every move. One by one, the mannequins came to life, their hollow laughter echoing as they closed in, split up. Jason yelled, the group scattering through the maze. That was their first mistake. Back in the asylum, Rachel and her friends solved the puzzle, injecting a dummy patient with the correct serum. A door creaked open, leading them into what looked like an operating theater. On the table lay a body covered by a blood-stained sheet. "Please don't make us touch that," Jen whispered. But before anyone could respond, the body sat up. Its hollow eyes turned to the group, and its jaw unhinged in a deafening scream. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, the group was alone, but the walls were now covered in fresh blood, spelling out, "Keep moving, or you'll join me." In the carnival, Jason's group wasn't faring as well. They reunited, but one of them, Vegan, was missing. They heard her scream in the distance, but when they followed the sound, all they found was a clown mannequin holding her jacket. The glow of the red moon seeped through the cracks in the walls, and Malthus's voice echoed. Not all players are worthy of escape. Jason clenched his fists. We're getting out of here. Rachel's group reached the final room of the asylum morgue. The exit door was locked, and the clue read, "Face your fears to claim your freedom." The drawers on the walls began sliding open one by one, each revealing a horrific vision. Marcus's brother, who had died years ago, reaching out to him. Jen's childhood toy, twisted and alive, calling her name in a distorted voice. Tara's reflection in a mirror, screaming as blood poured from her eyes. Rachel fought back tears. These aren't real. Don't listen. Finally, they found the key. But as they turned it, Malthus appeared in the corner. This time, his human disguise slipped. His skin darkened to an ashen gray. Horns jutted from his head, and his eyes glowed like embers. "You've done well," he hissed. "But remember, every victory has a cost." Jason's group wasn't as lucky. They reached the center of the carnival and found Meganor, what was left of her. Her body hung limply from a carousel horse, her face contorted in terror. The demon emerged, its form towering over them. "You failed," it growled. "The red moon claims its prize." Jason tried to fight, but the demon was unstoppable. One by one, the room collapsed, and their screams faded into the void. Rachel's group escaped the asylum, gasping for air as they stumbled out into the night. The building behind them was gone, only an empty field remained, bathed in the crimson glow of the red moon. "What about the others?" Rachel whispered. "They didn't make it," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "But neither did we. We left something behind." As they walked back to their car, the shadows seemed to follow them, and in the distance, faint laughter echoed a reminder that the demon's game was never truly over. Anna had always dreamed of traveling Europe solo. She loved the adventure, the freedom, the way each city seemed to carry secrets tucked into its cobblestone alleys and ancient buildings. Her journey had taken her from Paris to Vienna, and now to a small, picturesque town nestled in the Swiss Alps. Here, the locals insisted she stay at Hotel Dusk, an old and grand establishment perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking a misty valley. The hotel was enormous, with Gothic turrets and ivy crawling up its weathered stone walls. Despite its grandeur, something about the place felt off. When she walked into the lobby, the air was heavy, and the silence clung to her skin. The receptionist, pale, expressionless man who barely blinked, slid a room key across the counter without a word. "Thanks," Anna said, her voice sounding hollow in the vast, dimly lit space. Her room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor that seemed unnaturally long. The carpet muffled her footsteps, and the walls bore old paintings of people whose eyes followed her as she passed. By the time she unlocked her door, her skin prickled with unease. The room itself was beautiful in a dated way, ornate furniture. A massive mirror above the dresser, but the atmosphere felt heavy, like the air didn't belong to her. She brushed it off. "Stop being ridiculous, Anna," she muttered, throwing her backpack on the bed. But that night the first strange thing happened. Anna woke to the sound of whispers. Groggy, she sat up and glanced around the room. It was empty, but the whispers persisted, soft and unintelligible, as though coming from inside the walls. The mirror above the dresser caught her attention. In the dim moonlight, she thought she saw movement behind her reflection. She whipped around, but nothing was there. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly her suitcase fell off the luggage rack with a loud thud. Her breath quickened. "Okay, nope," she said aloud, grabbing her phone and flashlight. She left the room, heading for the lobby. But the hallways didn't look the same. They seemed to twist and elongate, the walls narrowing round her. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment she saw a figure at the end of the corridor, pale, gaunt, and staring straight at her. She sprinted back to her room, slamming the door behind her. She sat against it, heart pounding, until morning. Anna was ready to leave. She packed her bag hastily, determined to find another place to stay. But as she passed through the lobby, she noticed an old woman sitting in a worn armchair near the fireplace. Unlike the other staff or guests, who barely seemed to acknowledge her existence, the woman met her eyes and smiled. "You're not the first to think about running," the woman said, her voice gravelly yet warm. Anna hesitated. You know about this place," the old woman chuckled. "I know more than anyone else. Come, sit." Against her better judgment, Anna sat. The woman introduced herself as Marguerite, claiming she had once worked at the hotel decades ago. When Anna described the whispers, the strange corridors, and the figure she'd seen, Marguerite nodded solemnly. "This place is cursed," Marguerite said. "The walls themselves hold the souls of those who died here. They can't leave, poor things, no matter how much they want to. The hotel keeps them prisoner." Anna frowned. "How is that even possible?" Marguerite's expression darkened. The original owner, Herr Stoll, was obsessed with immortality. He performed ... experiments, rituals, sacrifices. He bound the spirits to the building, thinking it would keep him alive forever. But it backfired. Now he's trapped here too, feeding off the fear of those who stay. Anna shivered. Why hasn't anyone done anything? "The hotel won't let them," Marguerite said simply. "But maybe you can. You have the spirit, bore it, determined to help." Anna spent the next day exploring the hotel's hidden corners. She found a hidden staircase behind a tattered tapestry, leading to a basement that seemed impossibly vast. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers became more coherent. They begged, "Help us, set us free." The basement was filled with relics of hair stoles, ritual sigils drawn in ash, melted candles, and chains bolted to the walls. In the center of the room was a massive, cracked furnace. Marguerite had warned her that this was where the souls were bound, their energy siphoned to keep the hotel alive. But there was something else. A journal lay on the floor, its pages detailing the horrifying experiments. Hairstole had lured guests to the hotel, performed ritualistic sacrifices, and used their fear to anchor their spirits. Anna felt sick reading it. As she turned to leave, she heard a low growl. The shadows in the basement shifted, coalescing into a figure, a man, or what was left of one. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Hairstole, you shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice echoing unnaturally. Anna bolted, the air around her growing heavier with each step. She barely made it back to her room, slamming the door just as the lights flickered out. Anna knew what she had to do. Marguerite had told her the spirits could only be freed if the hotel itself was destroyed. "Fire cleanses all. I have to burn this bitch down," she said. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of Anna was terrified of what might happen. Would the spirits retaliate? Could she even pull it off? That night, armed with matches, a canister, put up gasoline she'd found in the basement, and more courage than she thought she had, Anna began her task. She poured the gasoline along the hallways, the lobby, and down the hidden staircase. The hotel fought back. Doors slammed. Furniture flew across the rooms, and the whispers turned to agonized screams. Hairstole appeared again, his form towering and grotesque. He lunged at Anna, but as he did, Marguerite appeared, solid and radiant for the first time. "Go," Marguerite shouted, holding him back. "Do it now." Anna struck the match and dropped it. The fire spread quickly, consuming the old wood and suffocating darkness. Anna barely made it out, stumbling into the cold night as flames engulfed the hotel. She turned to see the spirits, dozens of them, from the flames like smoke, their faces filled with relief. Marguerite was among them. She smiled at Anna one last time before fading into the night sky. When the fire finally died, nothing was left of Hotel Dusk but ash. Anna stood there for a long time, the weight of what she'd done sinking in. The townspeople found her the next day, exhausted but alive. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Anna left Ashmore soon after her journey through Europe, forever marked by the souls she had freed. But sometimes, when she closed her eyes at night, she could still hear their whispers, not of fear, but of gratitude. It was a night much like this one. The sky was moonless, the stars barely piercing through the black veil above, and the only sound was the crackle of the campfire and the rustling of the wind through the trees. People often tell ghost stories around the fire to scare each other, but this one's not just a story, it's a warning. Deep in the heart of these woods, there's a place the locals call the Whispering Pines. The trees there grow unnaturally close together, their twisted branches intertwining like skeletal fingers trying to choke the sky. No birds sing there, no animals wander through, not even insects. It's as though the place has been abandoned by everything living. The legend goes like this. Decades ago, a woman named Elise LaRue lived near these woods. She was a recluse, known for her strange habits, always muttering to herself, walking the forest paths at night, and collecting strange trinkets left by travelers. People in the nearby village whispered that she was a witch, though no one had any proof. They just knew something about her didn't feel right. One day, a group of hunters went missing near the pines. Their dogs came back, howling and foaming at the mouth, but the men were never seen again. The villagers were terrified and blamed Elise. They said she must have cursed the forest, using dark rituals to claim their lives. So, driven by fear and superstition, they marched to her cottage, dragged her out, and burned her at the stake in the middle of the woods. Elise didn't scream or beg. She didn't cry. Instead, she stared at them with cold, unblinking eyes, and muttered words none of them understood. Some say it was a curse, a spell to bind her spirit to the woods and take her vengeance. As the flames consumed her, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of whispering voices. From that night on, the Whispering Pines were never the same. You see, the legend says Elise's soul never left the forest. The hunters were only her first victims, and since her death, anyone who strays too far into the pines when the wind whispers doesn't come back, or if they do, they're changed. A few years ago, this part's true, by the Wire Group, of hikers camped near the Whispering Pines. They were experienced adventurers, thought the legend was just a silly story meant to scare tourists. One of them, a guy named Matt, decided to prove how ridiculous it was, and ventured into the pines late at night with nothing but a flashlight. He was gone for hours. His friends waited by the fire, calling his name into the darkness, but all they heard was the wind. When Matt finally staggered back into the camp just before dawn, he wasn't the same. He was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, and his hands trembled like leaves in a storm. He wouldn't or couldn't speak. His friends thought he was in shock. They packed up their gear and got him back to town, but Matt never recovered. He started sleepwalking, muttering strange things in his sleep, things that sounded like another language. Then one night he disappeared entirely. The only thing they found was a single footprint leading back toward the Whispering Pines. If you go near the pines, they say you'll feel it, that cold, creeping sensation, like someone is watching you, breathing down your neck. The trees whisper, just out of earshot, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, the whisper becomes a voice, and the voice becomes a call. People who've heard it say it's familiar. It sounds like someone you trust, a friend, a loved one, calling your name, begging you to come closer. The closer you get, the louder it becomes, until you're standing beneath the blackened boughs of the pines, and the whisper isn't outside you anymore. It's in your head, curling behind your eyes, filling your mind with things you can't unsee. No one knows what happens if you go too far in. Maybe Elise is still there, her spirit twisting and consuming anyone foolish, enough to trespass. Or maybe it's something worse, something older, that she woke when she died. They say the whispering pines are quieter now, at least during the day. But when the wind picks up at night, when it snakes through the branches and carries the faint sound of voices, people know better than to listen. And you, well, if you find yourself walking these woods alone, and you hear a whisper, just a faint, familiar voice calling your name, don't answer it. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't step into the pines. N. 1972. The Hensley family moved into Ross Edge House, a sprawling Georgian manor tucked into the desolate countryside of Suffolk, England. It was the type of house that seemed to breathe history. The wide stone steps were worn smooth by time. Ivy clawed up the crumbling brick walls, and the windows seemed to glisten like watchful eyes. The Hensleys, Susan, Richard, and their 3 young children, saw it as a new beginning, an escape from the cramped chaos of city life. From the moment they arrived, though, something about Ross Edge House felt wrong. The air inside was damp, uncold, even in the height of summer. The long hallways stretched unnaturally, as though the house was larger on the inside than it appeared from the outside. On that first day, as Susan explored the house alone, she swore she heard the faint sound of someone humming soft, melodic but eerie. When she turned the corner of the hallway where the noise came from, she found only emptiness. "What do you think?" Richard asked her with a smile as he unpacked boxes in the kitchen. "This place has charm, don't you think?" Susan forced a smile back, but the unease churned deep in her stomach as she stared up at the massive staircase spiraling into darkness. She felt a strange sensation, like the walls were holding their breath. The disturbances began subtly. On their second night, Richard woke to the sound of scratching. Faint at first, like nails on wood, but it grew louder and more frantic. He thought it was a branch scraping against the window, but when he checked, the windows were clear, and no branches were anywhere near. The sound, he realized with a chill, was coming from the walls. "Maybe ruts," he muttered, though his voice wavered. The next morning, Susan noticed strange marks on the wooden doorframe of the dining room, deep scratches that hadn't been there before. When she ran her finger over them, they felt fresh, as though they'd been gouged out during the night. She showed Richard, "We've got to call an exterminator." But the scratches kept appearing in places no rat could reach high up on. The walls, carved into the backs of doors, and even, one morning, etched into the headboard of their bed. Toby, their youngest, began crying in his sleep, saying he heard someone scratching under his bed at night. Susan started locking the bedroom doors at night, though it gave her little comfort. The scratching wasn't the only sound. Whispers began to drift through the house, soft and unintelligible, but always close enough to make her skin crawl. It was Emily, their 9-year-old, who saw her first. "Mum," Emily said over breakfast one morning, her face pale, her hands clutching her bowl of cereal. "Who was the lady standing by the window last night?" Susan froze. "What lady?" Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "The lady in the white dress. She was in my room. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, looking at me." Richard tried to brush it off. "You were dreaming, Emily. There's no lady." But Susan wasn't so sure. She hadn't told anyone, but she'd been feeling it, to her presence, a coldness that seemed to hang in certain rooms, a faint scent of damp earth that came and went without explanation. And at night, when she glanced out the bedroom window, she occasionally thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, or the outline of someone standing just beyond the tree line. As the days passed, Emily grew more withdrawn. She refused to sleep in her own room, crying if Susan tried to make her. "She's there, Mum," Emily would sob. "She's always there," haunted by her daughter's terror. Susan decided to dig into the history of Ross Edge House. Her search led her to the local library, where a dusty archive revealed the dark secrets of the estate. The house had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy landowner, Edward Merrick, who was known for his cruelty. But the true horror lay in the story of his young wife, Eleanor. Eleanor had been just 19 when she married Edward, a man twice her age, and neighbors described her as beautiful but desperately sad. One stormy night, Eleanor vanished. Days later, her body was found at the bottom of the estate's old well, her white nightdress clinging to her lifeless form. The official verdict was suicide, but whispers in the village suggested otherwise. Servants spoke of Edward's violent temper, of Eleanor's cries echoing through the house late at night. Many believed Edward had pushed her into the well in a fit of rage, her death buried beneath the weight of his wealth and power. Edward himself met a grim end years later, found dead in the same dining room where the Hensleys now ate breakfast. The cause was never determined, but his face was frozen in a rictus of terror, as though he'd seen something no living soul should witness. After Susan discovered the house's history, the activity grew worse, much worse. The whispers turned into wails. Furniture moved on its own. Susan awoke one night to find Emily standing at the foot of her bed, pointing toward the corner of the room. "She's right there," Emily said, her voice eerily calm. Susan turned, and for a split second she saw her woman in a drenched white gown, her hair matted to her face. her eyes wide and filled with sorrow and rage. And just like that, she was gone. Richard, once a skeptic, could no longer deny the truth. He'd begun seeing things, two shadows flitting across the hallway, lights flickering in time with phantom footsteps. One night, as he sat alone in the Pleavin room, he swore he felt a hand brush across the back of his neck. When he turned, there was nothing there except for the faint smell of rotting wood. The final straw came when they discovered the writing. On the wall above the fireplace, scratched deep into the plaster, were the words, "Help her, Chapter 6, The Descent into the Well Disparate to End the Torment." Susan sought the help of a local historian and medium, Agnes Wick. Agnes arrived one stormy night, her eyes scanning the house with grim determination. "She's bound to this place," Agnes said after a single walk-through. "Eleanor. Her pain anchors her here, and her fury is feeding something darker." "Darker," Susan whispered. Agnes nodded. "Something tied to the well. That's where it all began." Agnes led the family to the overgrown garden where the old well stood, its stones slick with moss. As they approached, the air grew colder, the wind howling with unnatural intensity. Agnes performed a calling to Eleanor's spirit. The ground trembled, and Susan heard the unmistakable sound of sobbing. Then Eleanor appeared, pale, drenched, her hands clawing at the air. Her voice was faint but clear. "Set me free, Agnes," instructed Richard to open the well and release the tormented spirit. As he pried open the creaking wooden lid, a blast of icy wind erupted, nearly knocking him off his feet. Inside the well, bones lay scattered, alongside fragments of a bloodied white dress. Agnes threw salt and murmured prayers, urging Eleanor to move on. The wind grew deafening, and for a moment Susan thought the house itself might collapse. But then silence. Eleanor was gone. The Hensleys stayed at Ross Edge House, though the malevolence had vanished. The air felt lighter, the shadows no longer loomed, and the whispers ceased. But every so often, when Susan passed the window overlooking the garden, she thought she saw her faint figure in white, standing by the well, watching. It was a chilly autumn evening when Clara first noticed the figure in the garden. She had recently moved to Brogtown, a quiet place with winding roads, small stone cottages, and an eerie stillness that hung in the air once the sun went down. Her new home sat on the outskirts of town, a quaint little cottage with a sprawling, overgrown garden that backed onto dense woodland. That first night, after a long day of unpacking, Clara brewed a cup of tea and settled in by the window to admire her new surroundings. The garden, tangled with brambles and ancient trees, stretched into the darkness. As the moonlight trickled through the branches, her eyes caught something at the far end of the gardener figure. It stood motionless near the woods, half hidden by shadows. Clara blinked, thinking her tired eyes were playing tricks on her, but the figure didn't move. It stayed rooted to the spot, its head tilted ever so slightly, as if watching her. A chill ran down her spine. Clara slammed the curtains shut, muttering to herself. "It's just the wind," she said aloud, though the pit in her stomach disagreed. She went to bed that night with the unease crawling just beneath her skin, and when she finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of the figure standing closer, just outside the window. The next morning, the garden seemed ordinary, almost charming in the daylight. Clara laughed at herself for letting her imagination run wild. But as the days passed, she began to notice strange things. She would leave her tools neatly by the gardens, shed only to find them scattered across the lawn the next morning. A single muddy footprint, larger than any shoe she owned, appeared on the back step after a rainy evening, and at night, when the wind was calm, Clara thought she could hear faint whispers coming from the direction of the trees, though she couldn't make out the words. One evening, determined to shake her growing paranoia, Clara grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the garden just as the last traces of sunlight disappeared. The cool air bit at her skin as she scanned the undergrowth with the beam of light. "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering. "Is someone there?" The garden was still, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. She was about to head back inside when her flashlight flickered and landed on the figure. It stood at the edge of the garden, its tall, shadowy form almost blending with the darkness. Clara froze, the light trembling in her hands. She couldn't make out any details, just the impression of a human shape. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her, and then it stepped backward into the woods, vanishing without a sound. Clara didn't sleep that night. Instead, she spent hours searching online for anything she could find about her cottage and Brogtown. The cottage had no dark history that she could uncover, but Brogtown itself, that was another story. She found forum posts and articles about strange sightings in the area, stories of shadowy figures seen at the edge of gardens, of people hearing whispers in the trees. One post, dated years earlier, mentioned an old journal kept in the town library that documented Brogtown's supernatural lore. The next morning, Clara went to the library. The librarian, a kind but wary woman named Mrs. Harling, seemed hesitant. When Clara brought up the journal, "You've seen it, haven't you?" Mrs. Harling asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow, Clara, nodded. "I need to know what it is." Mrs. Harling reluctantly brought out a battered old journal. Its yellowed pages were filled with handwritten accounts, sketches, penned cryptic notes about the woods behind Brogtown. One entry stood out. "The figure comes when the nights grow long and the woods fall silent. It waits, watching, whispering, calling. They say it's the spirit of a man who went missing decades ago. a traveler who wandered into the forest and never came back. Others claim it's something older, something darker, that preys on fear, banned loneliness. Whatever it is, it never leaves until it gets what it wants. That evening, armed with the knowledge from the journal, Clara resolved to confront the figure. It wouldn't leave her alone, and she refused to live in fear. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the garden, Clara waited by the window. It didn't take long. The figure appeared at its usual spot, dark and motionless. Clara grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" she called, her voice steadier than before. The figure stepped forward this time, moving closer than it ever had. As it reached the middle of the garden, the moonlight illuminated its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to pull at her, drawing her in. The whispers began, louder now, circling her like a rising wind. Clara clutched the flashlight tighter. "What do you want from me?" she shouted. The figure tilted its head again, and for the first time it spoke. Its voice was low and distorted, like the grinding of rocks beneath water. "Release me." Clara's breath hitched. "Release you? How?" The figure raised a shadowy hand and pointed toward the woods. And in that moment, Clara understood. Whatever this thing was, it was tied to the forest and something within it. The next day, Clara prepared herself. She packed a small bag with essentials and headed into the woods, following the direction the figure had pointed. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like a ceiling of bone. After what felt like hours, she came upon a clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling well, its stones covered in moss and grime. The air around it was cold and still, and Clara felt the familiar sensation of being watched. She approached cautiously. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a cyclone. She peered into the well, her flashlight beam disappearing into the darkness below. And then she saw it, a rusted locket resting on the stones, its chain broken. She picked it up carefully, her hands shaking. Inside was a photograph of a man, his face weathered but kind. The name Edwin was etched into the back. Clara understood. This was the man from the journal, the traveler who had vanished. He had been tied to the well, bound by some force she couldn't comprehend. "I'll help you," she whispered. Clara returned to her garden that night, clutching the locket. The figure was already waiting, its shadow stretching across the grass. She stepped forward, holding the locket out. "I found it," she said. "You're free now." The figure stood motionless for a moment, and then it began to dissolve. The shadows peeled away like smoke, and for the first time Clara saw a man's face, solemn, weary but grateful. "Thank you," he said, his voice no longer distorted. And with that he disappeared. The garden fell silent. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. Clara stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Clara never saw the figure again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woods held more secrets, more shadows waiting to be found. She stayed in Brogtown, tending her garden, but she avoided the edge where the trees began, and sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustled the leaves, she thought she heard faint whispers, soft and distant, a memory lingering just beyond the light. It started innocently enough. Liam, a 22-year-old university student with a passion for vintage fashions, stumbled upon a small, dimly lit thrift shop tucked away in an alley he'd never noticed before. The shop had no sign, just a bell that jingled when he pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mothballs and something metallic, like old coins. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a crooked smile and eyes that seemed to pierce through Liam, greeted him with a raspy voice. "You've got an eye for the unique, don't you?" he said, gesturing to the racks of clothing. "This collection just came in, one of a kind." Liam's eyes lit up as he sifted through, picked the garments. There was a beautifully tailored trench coat, a pair of leather gloves, a silk scarf, and a vintage hat with a feather tucked into the band. Each piece seemed to call to him, as though they were waiting for him to find them. The shopkeeper offered him a deal too good to pass up, and Liam left with the entire collection, feeling like he'd struck gold. But as he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shopkeeper's crooked smile lingered in his mind longer than it should have. The first encounter, first time Liam wore the trench coat, he felt a strange chill run down his spine. It wasn't the weather, it was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He shrugged it off and went about his day, but that night, as he hung the coat on the back of his chair, he noticed something odd in the dim light of his bedroom. The coat seemed to shimmer faintly, as though it were alive. And then he saw her, woman, standing in the corner of the room, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. She was dressed in a nurse's uniform, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Who are you?" Liam stammered, his voice shaking. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the coat. Liam realized, with a sinking feeling, that she wasn't alive. She was a ghost, bound to the coat he had just worn. Over the next hour, the woman's story unfolded in fragmented whispers. Her name was Evelyn, and she had been a nurse during World War II. The coat had belonged to her, a soldier who never returned from the front lines. She had worn it every day after his death, clinging to it as her last connection to him. When she passed away, her spirit became tied to the coat, unable to move on. Evelyn wasn't frightening. Her presence was sad, almost comforting. But Liam couldn't shake the unease that came with knowing the coat carried more than just fabric and thread. The other's curiosity got the better of him. Over the next few days, Liam began wearing the other items from the collection, one by one. Each piece brought with it a new ghost, and each ghost had a story. The silk scarf belonged to a young woman named Clara, who had been a jazz singer in the 1920s. She sang softly to Liam as he wore it, her voice hauntingly beautiful. She told him about her dreams of fame and the tragic fire that had claimed her life during a performance. The leather gloves, however, were different. When Liam slipped them on, the room grew colder and the air felt heavy. A man appeared tall, with a cruel smile and eyes that burned with malice. His name was Victor, and he had been a con artist and murderer in the 19th century. The gloves had been his prized possession, used to strangle his victims. Victor's presence was suffocating, and Liam could feel the weight of his crimes pressing down on him. The hat was the worst. When Liam placed it on his head, he was overcome by a wave of nausea. The ghost that appeared was not human, or, at least, it didn't feel human. Its form was shadowy and indistinct, its voice a guttural growl that spoke of chaos and destruction. Liam couldn't understand its words, but he felt its hunger, its pleasure in fear. The truth terrified. Liam returned to the thrift shop, clutching the cursed items in his arms. But when he arrived, the shop was gone. The alley was empty, as though the shop had never existed. Desperate for answers, he began researching the items online, scouring forums and archives for any mention of similar experiences. He discovered a chilling pattern. Stories of a mysterious shop that appeared in different towns, selling cursed objects that bound the spirits of their previous owners. The shopkeeper, it seemed, was no ordinary man. He was a collector of souls, using the items to trap spirits and feed off their energy. Liam realized he couldn't keep the collection. The ghosts were growing stronger, their presence more invasive. Evelyn's sorrow turned to desperation. Clara's songs became mournful wails, and Victor's malice seeped into Liam's thoughts, filling his mind with violent images. The shadowy figure from the hat began appearing even when Liam wasn't wearing it, its guttural growls echoing in his... Liam knew he had to destroy the collection, but it wasn't easy. The items resisted him, their spirits clinging to the physical world with all their might. When he tried to burn the trench coat, Evelyn appeared, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, "don't." But Liam couldn't live like this. He gathered the items in a metal drum in his backyard, doused them in gasoline, and lit a match. As the flames consumed the fabric, the ghosts appeared one last time. Evelyn and Clara looked at him with gratitude, their forms dissolving into the night. Victor screamed, his face contorted with rage, before vanishing into the smoke. The shadowy figure lingered the longest, its growls turning to a deafening roar before it, too disappeared. When the fire died, Liam felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The air was lighter, the world quieter. The collection was gone, and with it the spirits that had haunted him. But sometimes, late at night, Liam swore he could still hear Clara's song, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Now This is the final tale for the night. What do you think? Scared enough yet? Thank you for listening to Spooky Sleepers. Help your boy Spooker the Ghost out by liking and subscribing for more scary stories. And remember, stay spooky, pooky,